Good morning and thank you for joining us. So today we're going to start by going through a series of talks looking at the storied world of the Bible, really understanding the Bible as this big narrative. This promises to be fascinating and we're going to do it slightly differently. What's going to happen is we're going to have a short reading after I have prayed, then we're going to have the teaching bit, and then we are going to call it quits right there without any follow-up. And the idea is just to leave it hanging as you and I try and get into the story without having to listen too much of me talking at the end. So let's get on with it. And before we have me talking again too much, I'm going to pray the Jesus Creed out loud together. And then we're going to dive into part one of this fascinating journey through the Bible. So let's pray the Jesus Creed out loud. Hear, Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There are no commands greater than these. Okay, let's dive into part one of this talk.
In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." God said, "See, I've given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their multitude. And on the seventh day God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation. Many people find it quite difficult to get into the Bible for the first time. People often decide, I really want to read the Bible, perhaps when they've just become a Christian, or perhaps a young person who's gone to church either regularly or from time to time thinks, I wonder what this old book is about. And young people these days are quite often used to reading large books like Tolkien or J.K. Rowling, or even if they don't read books, they're used to watching movies and videos and so on, and getting into a big story. But when they read the Bible, often it doesn't seem like a story. If you open at random, it's dotting about. It's got a bit of this and a bit of that, and some poetry, and some teaching of wise thoughts and so on. And then it doesn't quite seem to fit together. There are gaps and difficult bits, and we're not quite sure what sense to make of it all. But the Bible actually, as we have it, the Christian Bible, which is Old Testament and New Testament, does offer itself to us as a large, sprawling, quite untidy story. And I find it really helps if we treat it that way and say, okay, if it's basically a story, what sort of a story is it? How does it work? How do all the other bits fit in with that? And that's what this course is about. Actually, when we read the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the stories of Jesus, You can take them as they stand, simply as stories about this extraordinary man called Jesus and what he did and what he said and what happened to him. But Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, in 4 quite different ways, are all telling us again and again, this is part of a larger story. This belongs with a bigger narrative, and you need to know something at least about that bigger narrative in order to make sense of what they're saying. So if somebody comes to the Bible and says, well, I basically want to know about Jesus, just tell me that stuff, and maybe we'll get to that other stuff later or not at all. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John will all say, sorry, to get the full import of what's going on here, you need the backstory. If it is a backstory, you need to know how the entire narrative works. And that comes through as well in one of the earliest summaries that we have of Christian teaching. In the first letter to Corinth, Paul says, this is what I told you right from the beginning, because this is the tradition we all share, that the Messiah died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised from the dead on the 3rd day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was seen by various people, and so on. And so Paul is saying these are the central events, things which happened very close, very sharply, but they mean what they mean in accordance with a much larger, longer story, which fleshes it out and enables us to see that these are not just random, bizarre events, but they carry a meaning, and the meaning is the meaning that is given to them by that great story. So this matters because if we take the biblical story of Jesus out of that context, we will put it into another context, stories of our own. Many Christians in the Western world have told themselves a story about the purpose of human life being to get through as best we can with your soul somehow being transformed or illuminated or purified so that then eventually your soul can leave this world and go to another one altogether. That isn't biblical theology. That's stuff you get from Plato or from Plato's representatives in the 1st century, people like Plutarch, a younger near contemporary of St. Paul. But many people thinking that that's the real story that the Bible must be telling, then find as they read through from Genesis to Revelation, it doesn't seem quite to be fitting. So they take bits and they make those bits into allegories or symbols about the story which they assume the Bible must be telling. That's a mistake we can often make. I remember once after Princess Diana died, hearing from a friend who'd been in a church the following Sunday where after the service there was a young woman who was in tears, and when my friend went over to try to talk to her about what was going on, why she was so upset, she was trying to process the sermon that had been preached, because the preacher had decided, for all sorts no doubt of good reasons, that instead of talking at all about Princess Diana, he would talk about Mary, the mother of Jesus, instead. And he was ignoring the Diana theme, presumably figuring that there wasn't actually very much that could be added to all the other things that had been said. But this young woman in church was convinced that the sermon must have been about Diana somehow, and so she was trying to interpret it with that focus, and of course it didn't fit, which just made her all the more upset. And people have often done exactly that with the Bible, so that when Jesus says, do this or don't do that, so that you may enter the kingdom of heaven, people assume that what he's saying is, these are the qualifications to get your soul into heaven after you die. And they don't realize that for Jesus, in Matthew's Gospel, for instance, the kingdom of heaven is what is going to come true on earth as in heaven. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, Jesus taught his followers to pray, on earth as in heaven. So the whole point of the story is not about souls going to heaven. It's a much larger, more interesting story about what happens when the rule of heaven comes to earth and what it means to be part of that movement, that achievement, that extraordinary revolution here and now. So if we're going to understand the stories that are being told, even in the close-up and personal narratives of the Gospels, we need to understand that larger biblical story. In fact, there's another story which many people get hooked on in our own day, and it's the great cultural story of the Western Enlightenment. I was reading an article just 2 or 3 days ago by a scholar who studied the Bible extensively, but was retelling the story of human culture as he saw it, with the Bible, including Jesus, simply as part of the backstory about some really great ideas that people had 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, but which then takes us forward through all sorts of twists and turns and through the rather awkward and sometimes shabby history of Christianity itself, through to the 17th and 18th century, when suddenly, with teachers like Locke and Berkeley and Hume, and then Voltaire and Rousseau, a new world opens up. And we, the enlightened ones, are now living out the fruits of that new world. Of course, I wanted to say, there's some problems with that narrative as well. There are some problems, for instance, with the different revolutions that narrative has engendered, not least the French Revolution, where they were so convinced of the rightness of what they were doing that they had to kill an awful lot of people, including many of their own colleagues, in order to make the point. Never mind the great revolutions and the great totalitarianisms of the 20th century. The Enlightenment has by no means been an unmixed blessing, though it has brought real blessings as well as real problems. But my point is this: many people today think that that's really the story that we're living in, that the Bible gives us lots of curious ideas about things that happened way back when, but we ourselves are living out of a new narrative, which has largely left the biblical one behind. And I think one of the reasons people find that an attractive idea is that they've never fully grasped what the story of the Bible itself is actually about. So what sort of a story do we find in the Bible? Well, as we find if we read straight through at a run from Genesis to Revelation, it's a story with odd bits missing. One of the bits which seems to be missing is the bit between the time of the exile in Babylon and the time of Jesus. There's a little bit about when some of the Jews return and rebuild the temple, but then there are long silent years and some books which are written which do fit in there, but they're not printed in many Bibles, particularly the Bibles within Western Protestantism. But then we get the story of Jesus, and then we get another gap, because from that story we look ahead, and as though seeing a vision, we see the ultimate future. And there's another gap, a gap, if you like, between the book of Acts and the ending of the book of Revelation, or Romans chapter 8, these great visions of an entire cosmic future, of God redeeming the whole creation. That is the gap in the story where we belong, because the Bible is given rather like an unfinished play, a play in which the author has written the first 3 acts and then Act 4, the great climax, and then has sketched how the 5th act is going to finish, and then says to the actors, right, now your job is so to master those first 4 acts and the beginning of the 5th one that you can improvise, you can take the story forward from the beginning of Act 5 towards the end of Act 5. And you'll only be able to do that if you actually understand the whole narrative, the whole drama, the way it was originally intended. Now, this claim about how the Bible works is a controversial claim, inevitably. Jewish people, of course, don't see it like that, because for them, the books that Christians call the Old Testament are their Bible, and they arrange it differently to how the Christian canon of the Old Testament is arranged. Instead of stopping with the prophet Malachi, they place Chronicles right at the end, so that the story takes us through from Genesis to the beginning of a restoration after the exile. And then the various writings of Jewish people since then, particularly the rabbinic writings of the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries AD in the Christian era, the books like the Mishnah and then the much longer commentary on the Mishnah, the Talmud, they are, as it were, picking up from that narrative and saying, in effect, we are now the heirs of this story, and we are going to treat this story as the place from which we live out what it means to be God's people in the world from the Jewish point of view. So it's all always controversial whether you say, as a 2nd or 3rd century Jew, this is how we think the story works, over against other Jews on the one hand, and over against the early Christians, and the earliest Christians, of course, were all Jews, on the other, or whether you say with the Christians, this is how we think the story works. And then you have the Jewish and the Christian stories themselves, which are hugely controversial over against all the other stories that the world tells itself. Because at the time when the New Testament was being written, the Roman Empire was telling itself and the world stories about the great achievements of Rome. If you look back to the days of Augustus, around the time when Jesus was born, then some of the court poets, like Ovid and Virgil, and then subsequently historians, and ultimately historians like Tacitus, were telling the story of Rome as a great long story reaching a climax with the early empire, that now at last the world had entered a new day, a new saeculum, a new generation, if you like, had been born, and everything was going to be different. Peace and justice were going to triumph right around the world. Now, within a few centuries, that dream turned quite sour, and people were saying, are you sure? Did we really mean that? And the early Christians in particular find themselves faced with the narrative of Rome and needing to tell the narrative of the Bible, reaching a climax in Jesus, not in Caesar, and then reaching out to embrace the whole world. So when we're learning to read the Bible as a story, we are inevitably doing something controversial. And in our own day, no different. Because when we say this is the true story of the world, there are voices all around which say, oh no, it can't possibly be, because we have other stories and we're going to order our lives like that. So learning to read the Bible for all it's worth as a narrative is never straightforward. It's always controversial. But as we learn better and better to do it, it illuminates itself more and more. In particular, it illuminates Jesus more and more. And I think that's what the early Christians would encourage us to do, to read the Bible in such a way that we understand who Jesus was and is, what his death was and is all about, what his resurrection was and is all about. And they would remind us that as we do this, Jesus himself promised that we would have his Spirit with us to guide us, to enable us to understand and to articulate afresh for every generation the truth of which that story is the vehicle.